Relations between the parties in Congress have deteriorated so badly that lawmakers overseeing an effort to modernize the institution are even considering bringing in a marriage counselor to patch things up. No, that is not from The Onion, I swear. The Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has made easing polarization on Capitol Hill a top goal for the panel. With us now to explain is Bloomberg Government's Emily Wilkins, who spoke to some members of that Modernization Committee about the idea. Emily, I got to tell you, even the best marriage counselor around, I don't know if they can repair relationship between Democrats and Republicans. How are lawmakers, though, trying to create a healthier political environment?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, when I was talking to the chair of this committee, Derek Kilmer, and he mentioned that he reached out to a marriage counselor, it was in the context that previously the committee's been looking to a lot of political experts as sort of how do we make Congress be more efficient? How do we help lawmakers work together? But they're really beginning to take a more holistic approach as to member relationships. And so, yeah, they've talked to a marriage counselor, they talked to an organizational psychologist, they talked to experts in corporate culture, and they're trying to think about a little bit more about how to foster some of those relationships between members that can lead to more bipartisanship on the floor.
And Emily, what are some of those ways they think they can adjust the culture?
That is a really great question, and that's basically what this committee is going to spend the next 2 years focused on. They came up with some ideas in the last 2 years. Remember, this group was started in 2019, only expected to go a year, then they were extended to 2, now 4. They focused on a lot of things in those previous 2 years, including bipartisanship. They had a few ideas like creating a bipartisan space for members, which hasn't come to fruition yet. They're also looking at potentially the House calendar. Remember, a lot of lawmakers, they work in these 4-day chunks, then fly back home for the weekend. Their wives don't know each other, their kids don't know each other, their husbands don't know each other, and they don't get to spend a lot of time together. So there's thoughts that perhaps they can look at the congressional calendar and find a way to make sure that lawmakers are getting to interact outside of the floor and really sort of build on some of those relationships that used to be present in Congress.
Well, let's talk about what used to be present in Congress. It's something that I've actually been thinking about a lot, especially in the context of Biden, because he has been a member, before he was president, vice president, of course, he was a member of the Senate for many, many years. And there are so many stories of him and other members of the Senate reaching across the aisle and coming to bipartisan agreement on some pretty big measures. Is it just a different time, though, in Congress now? I mean, it really feels so foreign to have Republicans and Democrats working together like they did decades ago. But at the same time, am I just remembering things differently?
Well, you're absolutely right that there have been many differences since President Biden first came to the Senate, more than 40 years ago. Some of those have been cultural changes that happened across the wider country, but some of those are also policy changes that have given more power to leadership, more power to parties, a greater emphasis on fundraising. I mean, shoot, before 1995, members actually spent most of their time in D.C. They didn't go home on weekends. And then that was changed in 1995 with Speaker Newt Gingrich. And that's something that the committee might not be able to bring back and duplicate exactly. But that's sort of the idea that they're going for here, that if they can get members in situations where they're not having to discuss legislation or worry about politics and policy, that they might be able to sort of find more individual common ground, and then that can lead to more common ground on policies.
Emily, is this actually being taken seriously among members of Congress? I mean, you mentioned not going home for the weekend. That's been something that lawmakers have now been doing for several years. Would they even be open to this sort of recommendation?
As far as going home on the weekend, that does remain to be seen. That is definitely a tricky one, but it's one that the committee is interested in looking at. And as far as taking the recommendations that the committee has already produced seriously, absolutely. The committee talked a little bit about earmarks. Now, earmarks are being reinstated in the House. The committee talked about things like improving diversity and inclusion. Now, an office for that has been made permanent. These are things that we've already seen passed in resolutions last year to make some of the committee's suggestions permanent parts of the House, and we expect them to further make those suggestions and turn them into a tangible reality for members of Congress.
Emily, you spend so much time reporting from Capitol Hill, from Washington, D.C. Does this get better? Does this improve? Even if they're saying they're working on it, do you see this happening?
I mean, this is one piece of it, right? I mean, you can only change so many policies and so many rules. And that's something that these lawmakers reminded me when I spoke to them, that to a certain extent, policy and rule changes can only mean so much. There's also a sense of culture that's going on. I mean, we see at least one member of Congress, freshman Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's been sort of a bit of an obstructionist within her first couple months in Congress. She's been controversial. She's sort of tried to use tactics to delay or halt legislation. And yet she just raised over $3 million, which is a huge fundraising haul for any member of Congress, particularly a freshman. And so what you're seeing are these obstructionist members be rewarded by individuals within the wider nation. And so that does speak to the fact that there is something bigger at play here than simply what happens on Capitol Hill. But Congress doesn't control everything, right? They just control themselves, and they're hoping that this panel can be a way forward into actually making some sort of change and progress in terms of efficiency and in terms of bipartisanship.
And hopefully, Emily, we'll have to have you back to report on what happens with this marriage counseling appointment. Really great reporting, though. Bloomberg Government's Emily Wilkins, thanks so much for your time.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.